I'm Nick Heddy. You're watching PAX8 Live.
Core values are not aspirational. Core values is who your company is.
Always be in a hiring process for when the right person comes along. And nearly every single time, the business has shown up because the right person was already there.
The best things that I am highly encouraging of is having an MSA with very clear language in terms of where your liability lies. Take an opportunity in these quarterlies to say, gosh, if we did everything right, what does a quarter from now look like?
Hey everybody, welcome to Technically Unraveled. Thank you for taking the time today. It's good to see you. We've got a ton of things coming to you here soon, so you don't want to miss out. There's a couple things that are new that I really wanted to just kind of pick your brain on. They're worried about the risks. What are they taking on? We have so much fun doing this show.
My wife and I actually won a dance contest.
We've got to have a dance off on PAX8 Live. I think that's what we need to get going.
Digital transformations are changing our view of what's possible, what we can accomplish, and how far we can go. In the PAX8 marketplace of the future, AI helps illuminate new opportunities, and your whole portfolio is within reach. You can go to market faster, work more efficiently, and accelerate your success, all with an intuitive interface designed to scale as you scale. Infinite growth is possible in the new PAX8 marketplace.
What's up, everyone? Happy Wednesday. Wow, I almost did it again. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to the game on PAX8 Live, the show where we cover all the cybersecurity shenanigans you need to be aware of. We're going to be talking about asset management today, which is critically important, and we might even try to define what an asset is. So don't let me waste any more time, but let me get through the housekeeping real quick. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. Remember, engaging with us on YouTube at PAX8 Cloud is the best way, because our production team can see that and bring it to us. So make sure you bring your comments and questions there. And without further ado, let's bring on Matt and get into the show.
Man, Dom, this is one of those where it's like such a trigger for me. Even though my wife threatens to cremate me rather than bury me, I swear on my grave it's going to say, what is an asset, right? Like that's going to be the question of the day. And I've even put forth,
you get
Dom,
it put on
that, like,
an urn too. Just saying.
An urn would that'd be an interesting urn to have asked. Like you can imagine the person reading that. Like, I need to make this funeral urn, and it needs to say, "What is an asset?" It's like clearly not you anymore. Oh, that's not nice. Anyways, I digress. But I joke about what is an asset, but I have this kind of statement I've made before that there's never been a breach that has happened on something that wasn't an asset. And I think this is kind of one of those living proof statements. What I mean by that is, if it has the ability to store or process data, then it's an asset. And therefore, if there was a breach and data was exposed, then that was therefore an asset, whether you knew it or not, right, is kind of the point. And so tracking what is an asset is one of those things that Roddy Bergeron, myself, as well as just several others went on for like 4 or 5 hours about one day of what is an asset and into hyperbolous ends. But to your point, Dom, today we're going to try to make a little more sense. We're going to be focusing on it from the lens of 1, not 2 and 3, which are other types of assets. We'll get into a little bit of that. But we're going to try to, walk through that. And then for the nerdy of those in the room, we're going to walk through Matt Lee's home environment, which I have over 100 assets in that are things that are in my environment, at least that would be conditionally called an asset from a network perspective, that have to be triaged and managed. We're going to play around with it. I may make some of you guys help me assign assets to owners. Dom, you may get to own some assets that I'll have you be responsible for updating, if that's okay. Just 30 or 40.
Sure. Yeah. Just 30 or 40.
Yeah, it's totally fine. It's totally fine.
Anyways, speaking of updating, before we get into the meat of the show, I hope everyone saw that there's a 9.8 vulnerability in Windows right now on the IPv6 stack. So it's an easy to exploit remote code execution with system
Yep.
level privileges. So patch window, the patch is out. So deploy the patch right now, because if your machines have IPv6 on there, it's pretty easy to exploit from what I've read so far. So I have not seen
Yeah.
a POC.
Yeah, and if you don't know what assets you have, you won't be able to then subsequently update them in Control 7, and to Dom's point. So, all right, let's go to some brilliant words talking about third-party vendor risk management with Robin Harris, and then we'll come back to the actual demo and a little walkthrough and explanation of the play of the game today. Thank you. See you.
Are you ready?
Let's talk about third-party vendors. And we're way on the other side of the whole CrowdStrike issue. And I don't want to talk about CrowdStrike, but what I want to talk about is the impact third-party vendors have on our ecosystem. Now, Health Equity recently had a breach, 4.3 million patient records. Social Security numbers, dependents information, health information, and this breach occurred through a third-party vendor. So what does that tell us? We are in a world where we're not isolated. None of us can really run our businesses without dealing with third-party vendors. We can't even run our lives, right? So we have to consider what kind of risk are we exposing ourselves to when we bring in a third-party vendor? Are we doing the due diligence that we need to do? And please understand, this is not a one and done. You know, I bought the vendor in 1990 and I've been using them since then. I haven't vetted it and I haven't assessed their security posture since then. That's not going to cut it. You need to reassess the security posture of vendors periodically by getting updated certs like their SOC 2 and the ISO 27001, or sending those security questionnaires, or revisiting their terms of service. It's not a one and done. And for many of us, it's a heavy lift depending on how many third-party vendors you're using. And the thing about this is we love all this technology. You know, we're in the age of AI and emerging technologies, and we want to be early adopters. But we also have to factor in, with each vendor we bring in, we're expanding our threat landscape, possibly. And we have to factor in the security requirements. And if that means you got to get tools to help monitor or assess the security posture of a vendors, or keep abreast on, did they have a breach, or did something go wrong, or has something changed in the industry that may make you vulnerable, then that's just becomes the cost of doing business. And if we treat it like an afterthought instead of operationalizing it, that's going to make it more difficult. And the primary thing that's going to make it difficult is that we're going to resist. But it has to be done. It's not optional. Third-party vendor risk is part of your business operations. And we all have to factor this in. We all have to get really good at it. We all have to set aside time, cycles of our effort, and investment money to include these activities in our business.
Time to level up. Level up.
Okay. Wise words about third-party
Always.
risk. And, you know, I've had situations where a vendor left a tool installed, or left a tool physically in a data center in Iraq where it got compromised and caused a ransomware event. So, I mean, she's 100% right on. And really, as one does assessment of third-party vendors, you really should have some method of which you're validating whether or not they are people that should be in your environment, if that makes sense. Right, Tom?
Yeah, 100%. And they need to be regularly reviewed, right? Because there's a lot of cases. There were so many times we ran into, oh yeah, that's the software vendor we used to use, and they asked for a domain admin account as we were taking over customers.
Yeah.
Right? And I was like,
Yeah.
first of all, no, but second of all, it's still here. Like,
Right. 100%. 100%. All right, well, let's get in the meat of it. We're one big play. What is the one big play? Managing your actual asset inventory. Roddy Bergeron did appear. He said someone said assets, so I saw him pop in. We've had a couple of comments. In fact, there was even a comment on YouTube, if you want to bring it up real quick, from someone that said, are humans assets, right? Are humans an asset? Yes. They are definitely an asset. They definitely have an identity. They're more covered by extensibilities in Control 5 and 6 around identities and access control. But they're definitely an asset, right? And they also have intellectual property that you try to protect in some ways with, the no-compete discussions, in some ways with other legal agreements, non-disclosures, things like that. So, yeah, great question. I don't know if it's being tongue-in-cheek, but it is definitely a great question. Humans are certainly assets. And hard to patch.
Really hard to patch,
yeah. All right, let's get into the meat of
it.
They
tend to be vulnerable to techniques of, more questionable intelligence agencies. It's not great,
It's true, very easily. All right, let's get into it. What are we going to cover today? All right, so first off, we're going to cover as an agenda, what is an asset? Again, we're going to break into that just a little bit. We're not going to get into all the asset types. We're going to talk about the life cycle of an asset, right? Did you guys know that, assets come and go? Like, I know that sounds silly, but they do. We'll talk about what is IG1, IG2, CIS 1.3 active scanning. We'll talk about what is passive scanning, CIS 1.5 in IG3. And then I'm going to demonstrate Run Zero, which is a platform that I use, developed by HD Moore and a partner, that is something that's a great free resource you can use as their community tool, not for your commercial purposes, not for your MSP, but just to get an understanding of it. So I use this in my own personal environment, and so we'll walk through that. All right, let's first start with, what is an asset? CIS 1.1 is what really starts defining what is an asset for us. Right, so CIS 1.1 says that we have end user devices. But if you notice in the middle, and I didn't make this easy to read on purpose, I just wanted you to see the breadth of how much is actually encompassed in that safeguard. In the middle it says with the potential to store or process data. So when you are thinking about the breadth, and I just had this conversation with John Strand, when you are thinking about the breadth of it, think first about the ability to store or process data. There are some things that you can cordon off and remove from what needs to be managed in a certain way based on its inability to store or process data. But if it meets that first condition, it's going to be end user devices, IoT devices, network devices, servers, mobile, portable, as we get into it. And it even goes on to say things virtual, physical, in cloud, remotely, connected to infrastructure in any way. So, it's extremely broad as we see this applied. Any thoughts on that, Dom, before we kind of move on, at least on the beginnings of what is an asset?
There was a significant event in recent history that was caused by an undocumented asset. And if we think about it, that asset became an asset when it got connected to corporate assets over VPN and carried a vulnerability, right? So these are things you need to think about. Are we letting users roll VPN on their home device to remote into whatever, right? So your asset landscape expanded dramatically with COVID probably, but then probably didn't contract a bunch since then. And have you gone back and re-reviewed your methodology?
Yeah. There's been major breaches that we've seen where someone said it's not an asset. They're like, no, we didn't track that. And like old boys running a Plex server that's 2,700 versions out of date, right? And they then pivoted from there. And we all know which breach that was. But the point being is, an asset is much broader than most people think, right? When we think about end user devices, people usually think about the laptop and the desktop. But do they often think about mobile devices? Like tracking iPhones and Android phones and who owns it? Is that DOMs or is that PAX8s? Do they have that conversation, right? Do they track network devices and servers, IoT devices? And that's really what 1.3 and 1.5 are trying to say is, let's broaden that scope with anything on this network. Now, the other thing I'll also say before we get going about this is, this looks at the approaches we're going to talk about in CIS 1.3 and in 1.5 are very centric on a traditional moat and garden kind of network architecture, right, Dom? Like when we're thinking about this kind of VPN, I've got this protected space, it's subnet this. And so everything we're going to talk about today does very much land in that, with one exception. As we get into Run Zero, we'll see where Run Zero is trying to blend the traditional scan a network with other means of passive asset detection that we'll get into and I'll show with other cloud services and other things that we can use in a modern definition. So the definition of what is an asset is really broad, and what needs to be tracked in 1.1 are all of the assets that have been listed here. So if I have end user devices, I need to track them. And goes on to say that I need to track the machine name, the network address if static, hardware address, the enterprise asset owner, right? Department for each address. It goes on to say all these things I need to track, which we can do this type of things. 1.1 could be done in Excel, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. If you're following CIS 8.1 has just been released, and on page 8 of the CIS 8.1 guide, you find this lovely graphic. And this graphic really breaks down all of the asset classes that they've defined. Now, I still find it woefully missing some of this sub-definition for SaaS or as a service, no matter what type of as a service application might be playing out, in the sense that it's kind of encompassed in applications there, but not stated. But that's a lot of assets to be tracked. And what we're focusing on, Dom, is for the most part this left one, aren't we? This far left column in one. So it's essentially that basic aspect. The only thing you can't find by scanning is which one of those? Trick question. Is there anything you can't find by scanning easily?
It's going to be removable media.
Yeah, it doesn't have a network address, right? Like it's removable media has to be plugged into some host somewhere. And so when it comes to that, the rest of it, though, for the most part, at some point connects to a network, doesn't it?
It's pretty findable.
Right? Yeah, it should be, at least in that regard. So let's talk about how they anticipate us dealing with that. Like, again, one of the things that we also said is if we're doing an asset inventory, the inventory needs to have these bottom things down here at the bottom: machine name, network address, hardware address, who owns it, right? Department for each address. Where is it actually under? Is it under Dom's Pro Services Department, which is under Academy, or is that asset under security team, right? Has it been approved to connect to the network? This might be something where you have the ability to find rogue assets. Well, why? Because it asks me to deal with and remove unauthorized assets in CIS. So I need to be able to do that as part of this conversation. So that this is kind of how we track that. How did you deal with asset tracking in your, and maybe we'll get to that in the next couple slides. So let me get through these slides real quick and we'll go. All right. So Dom, assets come and go. Help me understand that. I don't understand this. There's a life cycle of assets?
Yeah, I mean, if we think of the definition of something that stores or processes data, right, then it definitely comes and goes. We could go back to the VPN example, right? If I'm on that VPN and I have the ability to interact with corporate assets, but I don't have anything stored locally, hypothetically, if I'm no longer connected, I'm no longer storing or processing data, and ideally can't unless there's some grave misconfiguration, right? So that's the sort of cattle example we'll use here in a minute, but also assets just cease to function, or they age out, or you depreciate them out, or like assets come and go all the time. Your users get new phones and they hook them up to email and Teams and whatever else. Well, what happened to the old device? How many entry users do you have in your environment that have 15 devices registered to them, but only one of them has been used in the last year, right? Like,
yeah, and I just dealt with an example here at PAX 8 where my laptop was showing up once in autopilot with its old motherboard hash ID, and I got a new motherboard. And so now I have the same serial number, but a different hash ID, right? And so now it's showing up in autopilot the wrong way, and so it didn't get processed right, and we had to figure that out and delete the old asset. So the point is assets come and go in a lot of different ways, right? And one of the things that I wanted to get into is what you brought up, which is pets versus cattle. Right, I'd like to thank Sunil Yu for this. Right, Sunil Yu talks about pets versus cattle, and just to summate, we have certain things that stay around a long time that we treat, we care for, we might nurse along beyond their years potentially, and we have other things that we don't. We don't. They're ephemeral. They can just go away, right, to lessening in greater degrees. Well, the pets versus cattle is really looking at assets and trying to decide: is this a pet that I need long-term capabilities of tracking that needs to be looked after for a very long time? Or is this something that's cattle that I'm going to have as quite ephemeral, right, in that regard? If you're thinking about it in the programming world, ephemeral assets might be servers that spin up from Terraform to do a certain function, some service, and then go away, right? Or things that are in that nature that are very, very ephemeral to a desktop. You know, for the longest time, Dom, you and I have both been Azure Active Directory bound. We've both been Intune, autopilot capable, which means if you're a completely SaaS person and you have a problem, it's probably easier just to wipe and reload the machine than work on it for 3 days. Right?
100%.
And Yeah, so that then makes it somewhat like cattle in the sense that its OS, its entire operating system and state is going to be reinstalled and brought back up and brought in a way that we can kind of manage it that way. So when we think about assets, there's things that you stick around forever, like that one HVAC monitoring asset that's got an IP that's been in your network for 22 years, right?
The same cabinet as the credit card server. Wild.
Every time. But there's things that will stay around that need to be treated and taken care of and updated. And if they can't be updated at some point, then you need compensating controls, other things, which isn't the intent of this conversation today. It's really just about assets. But just understand that assets have a couple of different categories. Some that stay a long time. Servers usually fall in that pet scenario. Whereas, ephemeral workloads usually fall much more in that cattle aspect. So, all right. Good topic to cover. And anybody in the audience that has comments, please make them. If you have any questions, I know we've got Roddy in there and getting triggered on it. But okay, let's continue. So next prerequisite. 1.3 CIS Critical Controls Safeguard 1.3 says utilize an active discovery tool. Dom, any guesses? Like, what does it mean? What do they mean when they say an active discovery tool?
So active means you're well, yeah. It's well summated in the meme, right? You're actively looking for assets in some form or fashion. Now, when we say use a tool, hopefully you're not literally walking around the office with a duff in your hand looking for assets, right? But
that's true. The duff doesn't help much in that. Yeah.
Right. In some form or fashion, you are seeking out assets, right? Trying to find them.
Yeah.
Which in a networking
the traditional
scenario
definition,
is just scan the network. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Well, you're just literally sending out active pings to every IP, active connection requests to every IP to say, is anything here? Right? Am I seeing something in this space? And it'd be whether it be in this subnet space or whatever it is you're defining. Active scanning does exactly that. And we've all seen our versions of this, right, Dom? Like you ran an RMM, you've had a active probe that does probe and tries to say, here's an IP, it looks like that's an asset, use these credentials, try to install my RMM, right? We've done these things, right? So we've done some forms of active scanning. But when we're talking about active scanning, it's just that. It's knowing your address space, defining and then scanning that address space, and then finding what results come back. But you know what? If I don't want to answer you, I don't have to, do I? I actually could choose not to respond to you if I was wanting to not be seen potentially. And there are things, obviously we could get into a long conversation of ways, are other things that come into play, but that we're saying, hey, maybe I don't respond to active scanning. And so that's why we see this need to push to a passive scanning. So when we're talking about active scanning, back to that point, this would be doing a ping scan or an in-map sweep or some other things to try to say, hey, are there assets alive? This comes back and says, hey, host is up, right? So that would be a manual methodology of doing active scanning. So you don't always have to buy tools. There are free and open source methods for you to do this. In-map being principally one of the main ones, I would say, is how I might look at my own physical networks to find assets that'll provide pretty good data, right? If you do the full in-map scans, you can get service level, you can get... Yeah, you can get all of the what. You can't get to who or who's it signed to and all that things to your point.
I mean, you could get to the who. Like if it's pushing a certificate out, there's a lot of intelligence in network packets.
That's fair. You could definitely do some gathering of information, which maybe you're giving us a foreshadow into what we're going to talk about next week, potentially, Dom. That's crazy. But yeah, accurate. So what is passive scanning? Well, passive scanning, which is CIS 1.5, use a passive discovery tool, is kind of like listening through the wall to see who's chatting. Right? When you think about passive scanning, in my opinion, it is like listening to network traffic, sniffing existing network traffic, like a PCAP, right? And gathering that traffic. And what's the principal difference, Tom? In your mind, what's the principal difference between active and passive?
Active is noisy and somewhat cumbersome, right? You're storming a lot of traffic out across the network, especially if it's a large subnet. Passive is quiet. In fact, it tends to be undetectable depending on how you're going about it. So passive is quiet, and it's first of all, a great way to reconnoiter if you happen to have set access. But it's just looking at what's happening, right? Or in this case, on the meme, listening to, and then you as a practitioner, or maybe the tool is drawing conclusions, right? If I see a whole bunch of SMTP traffic coming out, that's probably some sort of mail server or copy or something is doing some sort of email transaction.
Exactly. Yeah, you're doing service detection even from that passive detection. You can tell what's happening, and that's the nature of a network, right? There's a lot of traffic that has happened that we can capture, especially if we're in a privileged position, that wasn't intended for us, that allows us to hear what's happening out there from others in the environment. And even more so when you bring your own asset to do so. You know, Dom, you and I gave away some land turtles, and we gave away some other packet sniffers and looking for loot. What was it? A loot bug, I think is what it was, right? That we gave away. Those were things doing exactly that, looking for, interesting packets, looking for secrets, looking for things that they can find out or suss out about a network. Well, passive scanning does exactly that. It's the listening to meme. You are doing things where you are using other things out there to determine that there's an asset there. And so a great example of the difference being one's active saying, hey, Dom, 10.0.1.1, you out there? Yeah, man, that's me. Yeah. I'm here and I do this, right? Where the other one goes, hey, 10.0.1.2, this is 10.0.1.1. Hey, copy? And I'm like, man, there must be a 1 and 2 out there because they both talking and I can hear them, right? And so that's the difference between passive and active, just to help people get level set on that conversation. And so passive scanning, you could literally just do a PCAP. You could just give yourself privileged capabilities on a network adapter that allows you to actually pull traffic, right? You can then look at it and say, all right, I'm going to sort this by source. I'm going to sort this by destination. Let's see if any of those destination subnets are destination subnets in my network. Let's see if any of these sources are source network. Obviously, they'd be in your, at least in your layer 3, I suppose, ability to hear the traffic. But the point is, I guess depending on how you're capturing it, I suppose I'll get off on a tangent. But
like the best way to do a PCAP is inline, right? Like
sure,
throw your capture on the uplink port of your switch, but even if you could just whip open Wireshark on your machine right now and start a scan.
Go pull up Wireshark.
And you're going to get all the broadcasts and the DHCP screens and there's a lot of traffic that hits you that wasn't meant for you just by the nature of TCP/IP. Right? So you're going to see a lot of assets.
Yeah. And that is why when you see like Controls 12 and Controls 13 talk about network segmentation, maybe there's a reason I might want to do network segmentation. It helps limit that level of noise that I can hear, right? So just getting off on some awesome tangents. But the point is that at the end of the day, you have passive means and active means. And I would even take passive means to extend to, do you have any agents that have the ability to say there's an asset? Do you have any other SaaS systems that are interacting with your machines? Do you have any web services that you're hosting that are interacting with these machines? Do you have any ability to determine what assets are there from that way? And so think of passive being more than just a network sniff in today's day and age. You have other tools, like my RMM may not know about this asset, but my Screen Connect got installed by a technician that was dealing with something, right? And you're like, oh, well, is that supposed to be an asset? Yes. And so think about the passivity that you can do by gathering information from other active components, right? Other facilitations of that information. So just a side tangent there. All right. So now we've gotten the basis of understanding of what we need to do. 1.1 says we need to track our assets. So here we sit, pen in hand, about ready on that sweet, sweet notepad to write it down. But let's talk about some of the technology methods we might be able to use to manage and track assets instead of that. So one of the ones that people just always overlook and go way deep in the weeds on is just straight up Excel, right? Like you could literally, Dom, make an asset ID with some GUID generator or UID generator and store an asset ID, a machine name, an asset type, a hardware address, an asset owner, a department, an approval date, and meet 1.1, couldn't you?
Yeah, 100%. Little tricky to keep up to date, right? But especially on like a small, non-complex environment. Excel's actually a great solution for this.
Yeah, so just understand, look at the tools you already have in your disposal before moving on to other things. Like get started where you are. Start with those assets. Right. Have a list that you know when you're going to deploy a new Dell machine or Microsoft machine or whatever it may be to capture that serial number, to capture the information of who's going to. That's going to be assigned to Matt. There's a lot of practical reasons for this. Just knowing what assets you've paid for when you let an employee go. Did they walk home with 13 different assets of yours, right? Like having those kind of things. So just start where you are. And I like to say this in my class is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If you already have access to Excel, you have the ability to set an access control on that, and you can start tracking and building those assets, it'll be a great resource to compare to when you start using modern live platforms and start doing this in a different way. All right. And it'll be easier as you start doing that scanning. You could even start automating moving the data from your scan to an Excel sheet if you so chose, to make that easier. Dom, you want to speak about this one, another option that's out there?
Yeah, this is a free open source option called Snipe or Snipe IT, and it's essentially it's a CMDB. It's an inventory and asset management software, right? So you run it, you load your assets in there. It does some cool things in terms of tracking who it's assigned to, allowing things like requests and that sort of thing to happen. And it's actually a pretty good sort of business grade CMDB. However, it doesn't have passive or active scanning, right? So you would do passive or active scanning and then ingest that into Snipe as sort of your asset inventory platform.
Your source of truth, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is, and if you know they have cool stuff like barcodes, so you can scan them and find that asset. It can let you add custom fields. You can kind of make it what you want it to be, and so it's a lot.
You can even track
essentially
toner and consumables, right? Like you can do a lot of cool stuff with it.
Yeah, and you got to know what all my RGB lights have as IP addresses, right? As we're going to see here in a little bit. So you got to know, man. They're important. Okay, so another one that we'll get to then is what we're going to walk into today and do a little bit of deep dive in for the remainder of our time. And so if y'all have questions, great. Dom and I are just going to poke through the platform and talk about it. I use RunZero personally. HD Moore, great tool, great product. Pax8 doesn't sell it, so there's no vested interest in us having this conversation. But I just want to showcase what a asset management software could look like and could help automate to make things easier and scalable. And for any vendors out there that are making products down this, then I would say these are the conversations that should be being had around the gaps in the MSP industry today. Dom, how did you manage? Let's just do that. How did you manage assets yourself in your own practice?
As best we could, So, to our point earlier, the RMM probing is helpful from an active perspective, and we didn't do a lot of passive. But then the sort of database source of truth ended up being either spreadsheets, if we were doing sort of a managed commit thing, but typically that CMDB in our PSA tool was everything, which was a lot of semi-manual work to maintain.
Sure. Well, let's get right into it. Let's get to the nerdy bits, boys, because as everybody's teasing me in our private Discord channel, we could go on about what is an asset for like the next forever. We're not going to do that, but we're going to let it through the lens of a platform like RunZero. So we're going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to take you into my personal RunZero instance. This is what I run for CyberCave, is what I call it. So this is going to be lots of juicy things to make fun of me over here. So y'all just enjoy. But when you start and load into RunZero, you have a concept of a dashboard. And this dashboard gives you your organization overview. I don't think anybody should find it absurd that I have, 96 recent assets in my home. So, that's normal, right? It's got to be.
That's
at least on the subnets I'm scanning.
Yeah.
It is an insane number. And I actually do manage, firmware on all of them, at least where I can. I do manage systems. And a lot of it's part of my home assistant instance that I do run. But you're presented with like the count of assets. You're also presented with goals. And you'll see I created a goal in here called update owner on all assets. And I made a goal for myself to say update at least 50% of assets to have an owner by Q3. That's one of the cool things about this platform is you can set these types of goals that you're going to. But there's a lot of other good stuff like asset trends over time. How many assets have been here over the course of this time? This is really helpful to be able to show these state and time delineations. I don't know if you can see that changing as I scroll through. But it actually says how many are online, how many are offline. I could see, Dom, think about back to your days of patching assets, how valuable something like this might be for trying to explain why you're failing patches for a partner.
Yeah, instead of going and pulling up time out of WMIC, just be like, we check all the time. It was off.
Yeah, it's been off. We don't see it in our hourly scans or whatever they may be, right? Exactly. We get into service trends. One of the things that's kind of cool that they're getting into, and we'll tackle this in a bit, is they're starting to detect what services exist, what things are out there. You see operating systems like, what are my most seen, what are my least seen operating systems, right? In this, you'll see I have Shelly Plug is my number one seen operating system because I do a lot with Shelly to automate things around my house. Apple iOS, Windows, Debian Linux, yep, checks out. UVC, G5, Roku, Ubiquity Linux, right? Their own flavor of Linux. It gets into asset devices. I have, the most common asset device in my house is power devices. That's fair. That's accurate. I like to try to conserve power myself. So anyways, any questions before we get past at least the dashboard gives you that heads up display, or anything you want to dig into on the dashboard before I get into how you find assets and what the inventory looks like?
No, let's go look at some assets.
Okay, let's get into the inventory. So you'll see on the top left, you get scan, monitor, and integrate. So before we look at inventory and assets, let's do the part that you would need to do, or do the needful, if you will. So when you start out in Run Zero, you start with scan, and the first thing you're going to do is deploy an explorer, right? And so you're going to go in and say, I need to deploy an explorer. There's a bunch of different ways to deploy an explorer. Let's just see, what do I have when I click on that? It gets into, you can deploy in Windows. Can y'all see that pop up? Yeah, okay, good. So Windows, Linux, Mac OS, and BSD variants, right? So they give you a pretty good range of options on which to install an Explorer, right? A 64-bit, 32-bit, ARM 64-bit if one should need. I did mine in a Linux OS, so I ran it, I think, in a 32-bit Linux OS and just installed it just as they gave me, right? My curl, it's built in, I suppose.
You can put it on your Power
PC
machine, should you need to.
If you need to, one could actually. What would that install look like? RM run 0 curl, so straight up curl chmod and run. Just a what? A bin file? Yeah, just a binary. Yeah, fair, cool. So we can deploy one. It goes built in with your GUID that takes it to your instance, right? So that you can see that showing up. And then it'll show up in your collectors down here. Let me go to my explorers. Where is that? View explorers. So you'll have your explorer here. And I just don't care that you have my external AT&T IP address, I suppose, if you want to be that human. But ultimately, I have an Explorer here that is doing this work. And it needs to have line-of-sight access or routability access, preferably line-of-sight access to any of the subnets that you're trying to tackle. So you might end up deploying different Explorers, right? Ones that are in different subnets or have more line-of-sight to that particular subnet. It's also helpful if your Explorer has the capabilities of a Chrome asset, because it can then look at websites under the web context from that Explorer's extensibility. As you can see, I'm in an ARM7 type asset in the way I ran this one. So the Explorers then show up, and when you do your scans, you can set up these recurring scans. And so I have this recurring scan. It's a daily active scan. And you can notice in this, it saw no new assets yesterday. No assets came back online. 3 more had not shown up, but probably the laptop sitting on desk 1, 2, and 4 over here. And then 22 assets changed in some way. 65 assets got updated by a task. So you can see this information of data. And this is the active scan, right? This is that first one we talked about, which is an active scan. Can you help people understand what this part's doing, what this Explorer's doing in this active scan, Dom?
Yeah, it's looking at, that in whatever IP space you've decided, it's looking at each IP in that space. And it's probably starting with, just an ICMP ping, are you alive? If it starts to see traffic, it might connect you in a number of different ways, much like Nmap would, and say, all right, let's try, HTTP. Oh, great. What's the server header? And then we learn about, maybe an Apache version. And it's going to run through various different, typically network protocols, and just try to do stuff and learn about the machine or the asset. And then as you could, it's now cataloging it all for you.
Exactly. That's exactly it. It's going through and doing that first scan we talked about. It's sending out packets. Once it sees something, it's reaching out and talking to it. And you can kind of see what all it's done. What I love about this platform, why I like using it for my personal self, is it gives me all of that data. Like I have the actual, data lake data field that we're going to have attached to this asset. And what changed? Like what all got gathered as it did this last time? What did it get this time that it didn't have before? And how is it getting it? And it shows those updates per scan. So this takes care of the active scans, and you're going to find that in this top left in scan. And that's what's going to be your kind of cadence methodology. You can set it up if you have enough Explorers. You can do whatever cadence you want. I find daily to be enough, mainly because when I was running hourly and also doing passive scanning, which we're going to get into in just a second, the two ran into each other. And so I had a lot of failures that I had to clear out before we did this. So I decided to change to a daily scan because I felt it good enough for me. So now let's talk about monitoring. This is this passivity, this passive scan conversation that we're talking about. And they started as, traffic sampling enabled. And this says, hey, we've found 81 assets just by watching them interact. They might not have had any front-end web UI that was going to respond, right? Think about assets that are out there that, for example, have some cloud UI and no local web UI. I might be controlling them with Zigbee, but they may have gotten an IP address initially that they do some work with their cloud asset upon, if that's allowed.
Right.
And so we can see that traffic being discussed and seeing it talking on that network, and therefore can say this must be an asset, right? That's what's happening in passive assets. What's also neat is with this tool, you can just upload a PCAP file, right? So you can just say, here's the subnet scope I want you looking at in this, here's the excluded host that I don't want you to look like 10 dot whatever it might be, right? And then you can set asset tags. So like I could actually say, when you have an asset you found here, tag as Matt super secret packet squirrel, right? And then you could say, whenever we want to look for assets, what was found by Matt's super secret packet squirrel is kind of the point. So it does allow you to do some manual gathering for passivity that allows you to also, like when you have some things where, for example, maybe it's a network that's fairly sensitive that you don't want to leave some persistent running asset inside that subnet. And perhaps maybe you want to use the firewall to collect that packet capture from port mirroring, right, or something to that nature in the OS of that of the firewall itself. So just think about the ways you could use the passive gathering without necessarily deploying passive sampling that gives you some risk of data, whether it be sensitive of that nature. So just some thoughts there. All right, so let's see what else we got. So we've already done our active scanning and our passive scanning, and we'll save integrate for later because I want to get into the inventory and show you what we have. So now here we find ourselves in the inventory, and I've hidden the IP addresses just to not clutter it for us, but also to just try to keep a little bit of OPSEC maybe potentially as I'm showing off some of my lab environment. But you can start seeing that they've found host names like CyberCave Firebox. That's my WatchGuard firewall that is at the head of all of my VLANs, right? That lives there. But it also found CyberBatCave, which is my Ubiquity UDM Pro. And what's interesting about it is it does do a good job of trying to bring them together as one asset. Like I think my WatchGuard firewall has 7 or 8 different IP addresses on it of different varying VLANs and subnets just for segmentation. And I know I do realize I'm talking about a house subnet here, y'all, so I apologize. Like it's a real problem. But I have like a dedicated VLAN for my work asset, right? For PAX8, which won't show up in here because that is not one of my assets that I scan. I treat that as something that's a segmented network. But it also does a good job of like trying to figure out, there's your iOS devices, right? You can sort by OS, and I can say, here's my UVC G5 bullet cams, my G4 bullet cams, my Ubiquity Linux assets, Shelly plugs, and what those are. They're power devices, a Samsung Smart TV, and it'll tell you what VLAN they're on. In fact, if I remember correctly, I have this structured to tag the VLAN when it finds it on a certain VLAN. So if it found it on VLAN 12, it created VLAN 12 tagging. If it found it on VLAN 11, it tagged it with VLAN 11. And you can make those tags based on whatever you call the scans. So you could say, this is my FCI network. Nothing should exist on here. Any new assets that are in my FCI and CUI networks, Enclave is going to be really, really treated as, oh my God, we have a new asset and we shouldn't, right? And so you can start seeing where those tags can get injected to make meaningful searchability for you as you go through managing assets in this. So. What else do we have on here? Well, we talked about that column of what we needed. Well, we need the name. There's our host name. We needed the MAC address or MAC address is. There's our MAC address or MAC address is, right? We needed when we saw the asset first, when we got rid of it. Well, we have first seen, last seen. So we have those columns tracked, right? We need to have something that says, hey, maybe who owns that? Oh, there's an owner. Oh, wow. Wait, OSEOL. Wait a minute, that gets into only use up-to-date operating systems. And that's a later control, right? And then we can say, where have we seen this thing? So you'll notice most of my sources are a run zero scan and a passive traffic sampling, which means that this asset has not just been found from active scanning, but it's also been found from passive scanning. Well, I wonder if we go the other way, will we find any assets that were only found passively? It would appear yes. There are some assets that were only found in the ARP table, but didn't actually communicate in any other way, right? So we have some MAC address we're unaware of. Well, that could be a hint. Dom, what would that tell you I might want to do with this now?
Well, step one is figure out what it is, right? How to find it.
Yeah. Like, what is this? It seems to be a fake MAC address. So my gut says somebody's got their Apple device or some device on private mode in VLAN 11. That'd be my guess as to what's going on. But it does give me something to go hunt down and figure out.
Is that your open honeypot network? Just
I do actually have an open honeypot in here, so that very well could be that, but probably not. It's on a different VLAN, so not to give up too much information. One of the things for anybody that's astute that noticed is we have a few of them that look like icons we've seen before, like Azure AD and Intune, which is really interesting because we have some that also are found in passive scanning, and then also are found, in active scanning, also are found in Azure AD, Microsoft Defender, and Intune. What are those icons, Dom? What could you imagine those are doing?
Looks to me like an integration.
Ooh, it sure does. I appreciate the loaded bat here. But that was the other piece I wanted to get into is we talked about active scanning and we talked about passive scanning. Active meaning we're sending out these scans looking for information and interacting with the hosts. Passive scanning meaning we're trying to figure out what it's doing. Like, is that a server because it's sending mail a lot? And then now we're getting into integrations, which I think is the beauty of where the future of cloud enablement and as a service plays out for us. So if you'll notice, I have configured Microsoft Defender, Azure Active Directory, right, and Microsoft Intune integrations because, again, we might be sharing too much, but I do everything at my house on Office 365 licensing, Business Premium at least, and all of my identities and assets are correlated to my M365 tenant. And so I was able to integrate these in that way and have it add more context to those assets as we go, right? So when we look at our Intune integration, the one feedback I'll give for them is they didn't do a very good job of being able to have one enterprise app to do all their things. You have to carve in 4 or 5 or 6 enterprise apps to do everything. And so I have different credentials for each service. Yeah, so I had to make a new enterprise app for each service. I just a little more than frustrated. That's okay. God bless me. HD,
but it is granular because you can.
It does give you granularity.
That's a lot of reporting.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and they're all read-only, and I could imagine you might want to do it if you had multiple tenants, no line-of-sight access. The scale one might need for an enterprise-type integration. But if I was looking on a one-to-one integration to somebody, I would really love just an easy automated setup process for that saves a lot of back and forth creating GUIDs and secrets to manage. I have 3 secrets to manage now compared to 1, right? Just all that extra work. Okay, so back to the integrations piece.
Man, that's an episode.
What it allows you to...
Not to have an epiphany live on the show, but we can do a whole episode on secrets management.
We could.
Let us know
actually. You know what?
That's secrets management.
Yeah, let us know.
Not just passwords,
episode
but all
talking about
secrets.
Secrets management.
Yeah.
So okay, very good. So this is now building this inventory list, and what's neat about it is the assets have an underlying GUID that they're tracking that then makes this asset, and they do get into like when they have outlier scores of this is probably inaccurate because we have conflicting data that allows you to go through and deal with it. The other nice thing about the integrations...
What does Beep Boop do? That's a fun asset.
Beep Boop is my Proxmox host.
Okay. That's a great name for
Beep Boop
a host.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my Beep Boop host. I may have just lost my light. It died probably. Okay, but the thing that I love the most about an integration is when it knows an asset, it says, I know who this owner is. This asset in Intune and Azure Active Directory was assigned to Matt Lee. And Kat, and Andrew, and John, and Kat, another asset, because she always gets more assets than me. I don't know why. That's the way it works. But you can ask. If you know, tell me why the wife always gets more assets. I don't know. But anyways, it allows you to start tracking that. But the problem is you now have all these other assets that aren't necessarily with an owner. And so you can come in and say, you know what, that thermostat that we have, I'm going to go ahead and say that that asset is owned as an ownership type that I have to create. And I can go in and say, this is home assistant owner. And that owner is, we're going to say a run 0 user. No, we're just going to say none. Let's say none. Visible. Home assistant owner. Okay, cool. Save. Let's see what we can do now. So can I go back and now set on that asset an owner to that Honeywell thermostat? And say modify ownership, home assistant owner, and now we can say HA or something. I probably would have to put a little more thought in how I want this structured, but I could make a category of like systemic ownership. Maybe that's the way I would change it to, is like systemic ownership.
Well, that's an interesting
human owned.
Yeah, and an owner doesn't have to be a human, right? That's not necessarily like a printer. Whoops. smash my mic on you. My printer is not owned by any one human in the organization. Everyone prints to the printer, right? So it could be owned by the IT group, or you could assign it to the managed print place that does all the inking and whatnot. That was a total brain fart, but you can
all the inking
be flexible
and
in how you do this. All the inking.
All that inking and whatnot, all the wet inky stuff that we do around here. Yeah, 100%. And so I think what this would be if I was designing this out, which I am doing, so I'm going deeper into getting these. That was a goal I just set for myself. And so on my goal, I should at least get one more that has been assigned an asset. And so I can start saying, which ones have asset owners? These do. I have these that already have an owner as according to when this was last pulled. And so the point being is I can start setting goals for myself and tracking that to see if I've completed it. For anybody that's really quick, they noticed that I actually just messed up. What needed to be happen was tracking the Home Assistant ownership that was done, and then I would be tracking that. Yes. But I like to tell on myself so you don't get the opportunity to. So I'm trying to. What else do we want to cover? You have queries. Oh, this is actually, I do want to get into this because this is something that I was actually talking with HT and Chris about 3-4 years ago about this when it was still called Rumble, about saying I think there's a path towards this being a vulnerability management and service management and other things that come into it. And when we look at inventory, what's really neat is not only does it do the assets, but it tries to come up with, hey, here's all the services that are in our world. Right? Here's 22 that's open, 53 that's open. As we go through it, we can see port 161 or 443. And so it attempts to try to start sussing out what services are running. Well, why would I want to do that? Well, now I can grab screenshots of what systems are actually there that we can start to understand what those assets might be based on those screenshots. I might be able to figure out from that what software is specifically running. Right now, a lot of this information I'm getting from the integration, right? My son having Borderlands 3 installed on his machine and Game of the Year edition. Me having Blackmagic Design installed on a couple of my assets. And you can even see it by asset count, right? So you can start seeing that, hey, 21 of my assets have DHCP client. I would hope so.
Well, that's helpful.
Anyways, I digress. That's helpful. Thanks. My EDR core is running, which I'm giving way more OPSEC information away. But I have all of those types of things being able to be sussed out and gathered. So you're getting the beginnings of a 2.1 inventory that you could start seeing the beginnings of, where you might want to say, what is this asset and who's it assigned to and what software does it do? They don't have that kind of meat in this yet. You don't have that kind of manipulability, but you could see them starting to build into that space. And then they also get into vulnerabilities, right? And I'll reset this filter so we can see. I have 2 vulnerabilities because I have SNMP default communities turned on my WatchGuard and on some of my Unify assets. And so you can dig into that vulnerability and say, oh, what is that vulnerability? Oh, I'm looking at all the ones that have these assets that have SNMP default communities turned on for public or private, so that you could actually use that to build a network map of my network and find out what's going on. My Epson printer, and a couple of my other Unify assets. And part of that's because I don't know that it's always a damn printer. Yeah, I just haven't dealt with it yet myself. But the point is we can now also even do wireless enumeration. We can start saying, okay, I want to define which wireless networks are actually my wireless networks, and maybe which ones are not, that I'm not needing to track anymore, that aren't part of my network space, that maybe a neighbor that I may already have the password to, allegedly. Anyways, I don't think we have to beat this to death, but platforms like this are making it very easy to do this and manage this and say, okay, give me a switch topology report. I actually haven't looked at any of these yet. These are pretty nice, some of the newer reportings. But yeah, anyways, lots of information coming in these. But at the end of the day, I do think using a platform-based model is probably the more scalable and defensible option of how we're doing it. And we're seeing these platform models bring in other data from other sources. Like I can bring in AWS, Census, Meraki, CrowdStrike if I'm using CrowdStrike Falcon. I can use Google Cloud, Google Workspace AD, Azure Direct if you have Azure resources, if you have a Nessus scanner or Qualys if you're using that. Shodan would only give you external information about systems. Wiz if you're doing anything around your cloud environment management. So this is very heavily enterprise focused in a lot of the stuff that they've integrated with. But one of the benefits that you did see play out is because some of those enterprise tools are available down to M365 business premium humans, then a lot of these capabilities come over from that default from that default integration being there already. So not saying, run zero is the one for you, but I would say find platforms that allow you to track an asset from cradle to grave, from the minute you see it to the minute you remove it, that have the ability for you to see that whole historical timeline, or do it in some other fashion. But I don't know that I'd try to tackle it without a
Well, that's going to tell you when something that it hasn't seen on your network before is on your network. That is a new asset or something you need to get out of the network, one or the other. And you need to know about this thing. So only active and passing scanning can do that.
Yeah, because now I can just go in and say, okay, let me remove my filters here. But I can just go in and say, all right, sort them by date, first date, newest seen, right? What's the first one? What's the most recent I've seen? And there was what? There was one like 5 seconds, I think I just saw. There was one that was really early. Anyways, yeah, I've failed now. It's okay. But yeah, good call out. It'll tell you when you've now just seen something. The other thing that was cool I just saw again was the MAC age. Like you can get a general idea of the age of your assets by when that MAC address was registered.
Ah, that's
right?
interesting.
So you can get actual where they have that data. You can see what's my oldest asset running in my house. Let me see if I have that. 2009. My Withings scale looks like old boy issued that Withings scale MAC address a minute ago. They just registered a whole block of them like 32 years ago.
They're just using the same one for every scale. Is what I think.
They might be. They might be. Actually, they're just reprinting them. I digress. But anyways, I think we've beat this to death too much. But this is my definition of what the beginnings of asset inventory and asset management need to be. And one needs to at least have a way to gather and have a place to have that single source of truth of what an asset is. And that's not usually going to be your RMM. That's not usually going to be a system that's meant to have ephemeral data in it and management for the day-to-day, operational and tactical. It's not getting into that tracking of an asset and its history over time. And you're seeing more and more players work towards this space. So,
yeah,
100%. I think that's it. I think we'll go to our play of the day and wrap this thing up. Dom, thank you. And next week's way more. All right, play of the day. Okay, we're in this thing. Play of the day today. So the point is, if you are not doing an asset inventory and tracking it, you cannot win. I'll just say it as simple as that. You cannot win. If you do not know where your battleground is that you will be fighting from, you will never defend the assets. If you do not know where they are, you do not know what they are or what they're set up for and what their configurations are like, you can't win. So I would say today's play of the day is start where you are, start an asset inventory. If that's Excel, if that's some burnt charcoal stuffed in inside some tree carcass and marked on burnt tree pieces that have been turned into paper, then that's what it is. But if not, use Excel, use a platform. If you have 100 assets or less, you could track as a small business by using the community edition of your own assets, or at least of your personal assets. They don't use it for business purposes, but track your assets, dang it, and use the tools that are out there and available to you. Do passive and active scanning and win. That's it. I did it in less than 6 seconds. I can just sit here and do stupid stuff for like 3 more seconds, I think, until they cut me off. 1 something. Anyways, yeah.
Game over.
All right, that was great. I hope you enjoyed that new segment. That's a really fun little segment for the end of our show. And speaking of, that is our show for the week. Thank you so much for spending your Wednesday afternoon with us. Don't forget to join us next week. We're going to do something a little different. We're going to get into TLS and X509 certificates and certificate-based auth, and we're going to see if we can't make a CA live on the show and get CBA to work. So join us next Wednesday, same time, same place. We'll see you then.